Welcome to AnimalChat, an Alberta SPCA podcast dedicated to discussing animal welfare, animal behavior, and animal protection. I'm Dan Kobe, and thank you for listening and for being passionate about animal welfare and compassionate for the animals in our province. Our topic today is reptiles, and specifically veterinary care for reptiles. My guest today is Dr. Susanna Ogle, a veterinarian from Harvest Point Vet Clinic in Edmonton, who specializes in care for reptiles. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ogle.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So the topic for today's episode is reptiles need vet care too, but many people mistakenly believe they don't need to take their reptile to see a vet. Why is that? What do you see at your clinic, Dr. Ogle?
Yeah, there's a few kind of common misconceptions. One of them is that just straight up vets don't know anything about reptiles or about caring for reptiles or reptile medicine. And while it's true, we don't learn a ton about reptiles in school. A lot of us have done a ton of extra training on our own and really researched this area because it's something that we're really passionate about. And so there are a number of interventions that are available for sick reptiles, and a number of diagnostics and treatments that we can do for them. So while your average kind of cat or dog vet might not know a lot about reptiles, there are definitely a number of vets out there who are very passionate about this topic and helping your pet reptile.
Now, is there a sense as well that because these are animals that would live in the wild, if they weren't our captive pets in Alberta, that they should be able to manage on their own?
Yes and no. And I think that any animal that we take into our care, whether it's a domestic species or typically considered a wildlife species, we have a responsibility to that animal to provide it with the best possible care that we can. And in the situation of reptiles especially, a lot of the time we're the ones who are causing the problems by not giving them that adequate environment that they would be getting if they were in the wild.
Well, and that probably is a good point to talk about first then. And from what I was reading, what I understand is that if you get a reptile, if you've recently acquired one, probably a good idea to take it to a vet that specializes in reptile care relatively quickly. I'm guessing that's because you're going to learn a lot about what that animal needs.
Yes, absolutely. So, first vet visit shortly after bringing home a new animal is always recommended. For reptiles, we're obviously going to do a complete physical exam and ensure that that animal appears healthy. But we also spend a lot of time taking history about your particular setup for that animal, what you're planning on keeping it in, and how you're planning on caring for it, and then helping to advise owners on some of the best practices for whichever species they bring home with them. Right? There's huge variety of reptiles, and certainly not even all geckos should be kept the same, and we can help kind of guide you towards appropriate information, maybe correct some misconceptions that you may already have.
And when we're talking reptiles, I guess we should clarify we're talking snakes, geckos, bearded dragons, tortoises, turtles.
Yep, absolutely.
Pretty much all of those, eh?
All those things.
Do a lot of people not realize once they have these animals what or how much care is needed to take care of them?
Absolutely. Their time commitment, just like any other pet. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the time they're going to commit to this pet is a lot of the time not like animal focused. So you think, when you're committing time to your cat, you're playing with your cat, you're feeding your cat, or with your dog, you're taking it on walks. With reptiles, you're really doing a lot of like enclosure maintenance. making sure humidities and temperatures are right, making sure lights are positioned appropriately. And so for many people, they find this incredibly rewarding. But for a lot of people, it's not for them. They think they're just going to get a cool lizard and spend all their time hanging out with their lizard, and they don't realize how much care goes into the environment of that animal.
Which is why that visit right off the bat is so important, to get that right from the very beginning.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if the animal does get sick, I should point out, we are the Alberta SPCA, so we enforce the Animal Protection Act in Alberta, and the Animal Protection Act does say that if an animal is sick or injured, you are required by law to take it to receive appropriate care. So even if the animal is one that you may not think you need to take to the vet, regardless of what species it is, if it's your pet, you must seek care if the animal looks like it's not doing well. So when it comes to reptiles, from what I understand, that they're actually quite good at hiding their illnesses. So figuring out when they aren't doing well is not easy to do. Is that right?
No. And so I guess there's some differentiation to be made between, are they good at hiding their illness, or are we bad at detecting their illness? And we, at this point, there's such big kind of taxonomic differences between reptiles and amphibians and mammals. We're a little bit better at recognizing pain and discomfort in mammals. But there hasn't been a lot of research done, and they don't use similar cues to me and you and our cats and dogs to show that they are experiencing pain, discomfort, or distress. And so it's very, very easy to miss those signs at home if you're not trained to see them. And even for those of us who are trained to see them, we still have a very limited understanding of it. So absolutely, like, we recommend yearly examinations to help ensure that we are catching some of those early signs of illness, and that we don't wait until it's too late, until, the animal is very, very ill before we see them in the clinic.
Do you have an example at all of one of those illnesses that, if you know to look for it somewhat becomes obvious at that point?
Yeah. So one of the more common things that I see would be metabolic bone disease. And this one can be a little bit tricky because the early signs are vague. We might be a little lethargic or not eating as well as normal. But then there are some really obvious signs as the disease progresses. So things like weakness and muscle tremors, or especially with lizards, walking on the backs of their hands. For us, when we see those things, it's like an absolute trigger that this thing has low calcium. We need to address metabolic bone disease, which is also sometimes known as nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. But for other people, they might just be like, oh, my lizard is doing this weird thing where it walks on the backs of its feet, and it's been doing that, it has this weird trait that I haven't seen in another bearded dragon. It's been doing it for weeks or months sometimes. Whereas for us, that's like a huge red flag.
And I was going to ask if you see animals coming in where the issue seems to have been there for a long period of time because the person didn't bring their reptile in.
Absolutely. This is something that it does frustrate me a little bit, and I'm never going to be upset with someone for bringing their animal to the vet, right? But then sometimes people either miss the signs for long enough that by the time they get to the vet, it's critical, or they have this idea that the vet can't help me anyways, so I'm not going to bring my pet in because the vet won't know what's going on, or the vet is too expensive, or I'm going to try to treat it at home for a few weeks or a few months before I bring it into the vet. And sometimes, if we had been able to have that intervention weeks or months earlier, the outcome would have been much better for the pet. It would have been less expensive for the owner because we would have been doing maybe some more minor treatments, and the animal wouldn't have had to be uncomfortable or suffering for that period of time.
Metabolic bone disease, calcium deficiency is one of the major ones. What else do you see?
Another really common preventable illness in reptiles that we see is hypovitaminosis A, or vitamin A deficiency. And this is most common in a few of our gecko species, chameleons, and turtles and tortoises. They have higher vitamin A requirements than other reptiles. And they also, kind of depending on their species, have different vitamin A requirements. So carnivores and herbivores actually have different vitamin A needs in terms of preformed vitamins versus carotenoids. So again, making sure that you understand your pet's needs is really important, even before you bring them home, to make sure they're getting appropriate nutrition. And again, this one is really preventable by making sure they have appropriate supplementation. Signs include swelling and discharge around the eyes. Sometimes these kind of big masses on the face, just behind the eyes, or on the underside of the tail, these masses can form as well. And yellow crusting around the mouth and lips is another common sign of vitamin A deficiency.
And I was going to ask, in most of these cases, it's just a case of adding or giving them the appropriate food. Is that what it is, or a supplement to the food?
Yeah, so most of it's preventable by making sure they have appropriate diet and supplements. The treatment isn't always then just you can go back and give it a supplement now. Quite often it advances into this illness where now we might need to we might have an infection, we might need to treat with antibiotics or pain medication, or even by removing these masses that develop, which are usually plugs of excess keratin. And so, just giving a little bit of a sprinkled vitamin, depending on the species, somewhere between once every other week and several times a week, we could have prevented, this expensive and intensive treatment for your pet.
Is there a sense with some reptile owners that reptiles don't feel pain the same way that other animals do? Yeah,
there is. And I think that we've come a long way on this in this area, kind of veterinary medicine more recently. But we still, like I mentioned before, there's a lot we don't understand about reptile pain and distress. But reptiles do absolutely experience pain, stress, like emotional distress, just like mammals do. And there's no doubt about that. And just because you and I can't maybe easily recognize that pain does not mean that they don't experience it.
Another common illness easily diagnosed, from what I understand, is chronic subclinical dehydration, which I'm guessing is exactly what it sounds like, dehydration, yes. Lack of water.
Yes. So this can be caused, it basically is caused by insufficient humidity or water intake. And there have been a lot of myths around reptiles and their water needs. So some people have the idea that reptiles get all the water they need from the food they eat. That's not true. They need water, and they need appropriate water sources. So some reptiles will drink standing water. Some will not. Some will only drink running water or dripping water. Some need to be misted and will lick the mist off of things. So again, this comes down to understanding your specific species needs and how they can be met. And also, environmental humidity can play a huge role in this. And as you can imagine, in Alberta, it can be very difficult to maintain environmental humidity at an adequate level for our tropical species. Again, something you need to consider when you're getting a pet. How hard is it going to be to maintain that particular environment given our unique climate here in Alberta?
It's probably drier than most of those, or a lot of those reptiles anyway. I'm guessing there's
Yes.
some that are native to deserts that are probably do quite a bit better than the ones that are from a jungle environment.
Absolutely. And it's interesting sometimes to read about other reptile vets and the issues they experience in other climates, because they're, saying, oh, my client is keeping this desert species, and it's always suffering from respiratory infections because the humidity is too high. Like, I've never experienced that problem.
And you talked about off the top about the environment that you keep your pet in being so important, and obviously this relates to that. And light is another big one, if I understand correctly, right? A UV light, and not
Yeah.
just UV light, but the right kind of UV light.
That's right. So this relates back to that metabolic bone disease that we initially discussed. So metabolic bone disease, also known as hypocalcemia or calcium deficiency, or nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, is caused due to an imbalance in the calcium, phosphorus, and D3, that vitamin D3 that a reptile is exposed to or has access to. And this is a really super fine balance, and also species dependent. But if any one of those three things kind of gets out of whack, it can lead to really excessive leaching of calcium from the bones, making the bones very soft and rubbery, making them grow inappropriately. They can develop what we call pathologic fractures. So just breaking for, with normal use. And can also cause issues with muscular strength, tremors, that kind of thing. And so the vitamin D3 component is the manufacturing of that is controlled by UVB light. So different species have different requirements for this, but recent research suggests that almost all reptile species, even nocturnal species, benefit from some UVB light. And that is going to depend very much on the species, the intensity of the light that they need, the duration of exposure that they need. But it can range from, this animal can probably survive without UVB light, especially if they have a vitamin D3 supplement, all the way to this animal could become extremely ill very quickly without adequate UVB light. And then you did allude to the difference between different types of UV light. UVA light is less essential in terms of, it doesn't contribute to that metabolic pathway with the calcium. However, lots of reptiles are unable to see color or see color well without exposure to UVA light. So UVA can actually go a long way in improving kind of their how interesting their existence is, but also improving their appetites, because they are now seeing their greens or their veggies in full color. And that's more interesting than eating gray veggies all the time, apparently.
And if we could ask them, they would tell us that. But
Yeah,
obviously,
yes.
obviously, it would make sense to anybody that full color is just more exciting.
Yeah. And this is kind of, partially presumptive on our part, but we do know that animals who have exposure to UVA light tend to display better appetites.
And from what I understand, reptiles that are desert species that would receive a lot of natural light still require some time with no light. Is that correct?
Yes. So they still need a light cycle, right? Again, depending on the species, where in the world they live, you may need to do like a 12-hour light cycle. Sometimes, if you are actually really interested in breeding or that kind of thing, you might need to vary that if you want successful breeding. But you got to have some time off from the sun. They need to sleep, they need their rest. And too much UV exposure can cause burns, and also, quote unquote, skin cancer in reptiles, like it can in people as well. So we have to be careful about that too.
Wow. Enrichment, I'm assuming that there are quite a few species that would require a little enrichment to make their life in their enclosure just a little bit more exciting.
Yeah, this is a topic I don't get to talk about very much. So this is great. I spend so much time talking about like basic husbandry that quite often we never get to the enrichment part. But yes, I mean, for people who aren't familiar, and enrichment is just anything that we can add to an animal's everyday life to stimulate a little bit of more interest, more brain power, more decision making, something new and exciting that will improve their quality of life. I think most species would benefit from what we call enrichment. There's just a wide variety of ways we can do this. With snakes especially, they don't always deal well with rapid changes to their environment, but we use scent enrichment with them a lot. So it sounds really kind of icky, but taking a prey item or part of a prey item and kind of rubbing it on different parts of the cage furniture, but not necessarily giving them the prey item, can make them spend more time searching and looking and just exploring and using that environment a little bit more. And novel ways of feeding as well. So sometimes putting clips up high, and like attaching a piece of lettuce to that or some greens, and then having your lizard have to kind of stretch and move differently in order to access that. That's another enrichment we can provide. Lots of reptiles and snakes enjoy some time in a pool of like appropriately temperatured water, either swimming or splashing. So there's all kinds of reptile enrichment ideas available out there. And yeah, that's a topic we could spend a whole other podcast talking about.
Essentially, you're trying to offer your pet an experience that would be somewhat similar to what they would have in the wild, and because the animals, just because they're in an aquarium or whatever enclosure they have, don't lose those basic instincts.
Exactly, yeah. And we want them to use those physical characteristics that they've evolved and use those brain processing power that they've developed in order to solve problems and move their bodies in ways that they maybe wouldn't if we just gave them food in a dish every day and that was it.
And for a good comparison, I think, and we talk about it here all the time at the SPCA, is that if you're talking about cats, is that their toys mimic hunting, because cats are natural hunters and they enjoy that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and same thing goes for reptiles.
So I think as we begin to wind this up, I think what we're getting to is that before making a decision to add a reptile to your home, a lot of research is probably necessary to make sure that you understand the animal that you're getting, its needs, and probably as well understanding how long that some reptiles do live, because this isn't a 2 to 3 year commitment for most of them. I'm guessing it's 8, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. The lifespan of reptiles is on average going to be much longer than a similarly sized mammal. So, even something simple that we think of like as a common reptile pet, like a leopard gecko or bearded dragon, you're looking at least 10 to 15 years of commitment for that. But then there are other species like red-tailed boas or ball pythons that are also quite commonly kept pets that you're looking at 20 to 30 years of commitment. And then if you want to get into your turtles and tortoises, a box turtle or red-eared slider, again, smaller species, common, used to be very commonly kept as like childhood pets, 25 to 35 years they can live. And then, there's even on top of that, something like a sulcata tortoise, which you can buy as a little baby 3 or 4 inch long tortoise, can live greater than 50 years. So really understanding that pet, and like you alluded to, not just the lifespan, but the cost of the pet. When we're talking reptiles, you can't just think about the cost of the animal, because the cost of the setup that you need to adequately care for the animal is often many, many times more than the cost of the animal itself. So you really need to research, do you have enough money to provide the appropriate enclosure, the appropriate temperature gauges, humidity gauges, misting systems, UV lights, other, basking spot lights, just to provide a minimum adequate environment. Then time commitment, the actual size of the enclosure. Your pet might be fairly small, like a leopard gecko. That doesn't mean that it can live in a little box. It does need to have room to move around and explore, because this isn't a pet that is going to be roaming around your house. So do you have the space, especially as that animal grows? So I alluded to that sulcata tortoise before, that you can buy when it's 3 or 4 inches long. Well, it's going to grow to be over 100 pounds, and it's going to need its whole own room. So as your snake or your lizard or your turtle or tortoise grows, are you still going to be able to provide adequate enclosure for it?
And it's worth, we should point out, it's also important to then have a plan. If you take on the animal, it's your responsibility to find the next stage of its life, the next owner, whether that be through a will if it outlives you, or finding an appropriate home if you no longer want it.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that you are prepared if you become ill or unable to care for your animal, that you have a plan for that in place as well. And then, I mean, there's so many other things to consider. Do you have access to a reptile vet? We unfortunately get calls all the time from people in like northern BC or far north Alberta, and they aren't within access of a reptile vet. And what's your plan? If you don't have direct access, get a relationship with a vet that you can do some telemedicine with if needed. Discuss with your local vet, in the case of an emergency, would you be willing to see this pet even though it's not your normal species, and would you be willing to consult with a reptile vet? Another thing to think about is who's going to be providing care for this pet in your household, because a lot of the reptiles that I do see were brought in by a parent after they realized that a child was not providing adequate care. These are not animals that are always appropriate as a quote unquote beginner pet or for children. An adult needs to be supervising the care of this animal at all times as well.
We could absolutely do probably 2 or 3 other podcast episodes on the various topics that we've brought up today. But this has been great information. Dr. Ogle, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this. And I'm sure we'll check in with you again soon.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. This is definitely a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you for giving me this platform.
If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to listen to our episode from last summer called Budgies Are Not Starter Pets, when we discuss the commitment it takes to have an exotic bird as a pet. You can find that episode from August 20th, 2021 on our website, albertaspca.org/news/podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this episode. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.